Hey everybody, Matt here at the Pure Intentions Coffee Skills Campus. We've been receiving a lot of questions from all of our cold brew accounts about kegerators, specifically how they work, how they can troubleshoot on their own. And so today we're going to delve into all things kegerator and cold brew to understand the different parts and components in a standard single tap and double tap kegerator keg box, down to the keg, the nitro tank, and the lines that run inside, so that you can all understand a little bit more about how these boxes operate and hopefully keep them clean and functioning well in your own environment. So we're going to start by looking at the inside of the keg box and working our way up. When you first open the door, you're going to see a couple of different tanks and some tubes running around. The big tank on the left is the cold brew vessel itself, which is called a sixtel, or 1/6 of a barrel. Ours hold 5 gallons. We also have the coupler on the top here, and this is a Sankey D style coupler that you'll see on standard American beer kegs as well. This tank on the right is our nitrogen tank. We recommend only 100% food grade nitrogen. There are a number of different gas products on the market that include CO2 and nitrogen mixtures, but for our Pure Intentions cold brew coffee, we really do recommend only 100% food grade nitrogen. So I'm going to pull these tanks out and we'll talk about some specific components. So this nitrogen tank here is actually the gas source that's used to push the cold brew coffee up through the liquid line and allow you to fill your cups at the top tap here. So this is very important to understand all of the different components that are on this tank and how they work, because most troubleshooting that we do over the phone is related to something that's wrong with the nitro tank. So first thing we start with is the valve on the top, which is similar to a propane tank valve, where you turn it in the clockwise direction to turn it off and the counterclockwise direction to turn it on. So right now we have this in the on position, which means gas is able to escape from the tank. And the next step here is the nitrogen regulator. So the nitrogen regulator allows us to regulate the amount of pressure coming out of the tank. This pressure, if it were just unregulated, would be entirely too much for the cold brew tank here. So we have to regulate it down to a PSI, or pounds per square inch, that we like to see our cold brew operate at, so it doesn't come out too fast or too slow from the tap. There are 2 different PSI settings, one for cold brew classic and one for cold brew nitro. So when you're setting or checking your nitrogen tank regulator, be sure that you're adjusting the PSI to the specific product that you're pouring. So talking about the regulator itself, we have a couple of different valves here that we can work with. This valve on the front of our particular unit here is a screw valve that allows us to turn up or turn down the pressure. So there's a locking nut on the front, and if I loosen that locking nut, I can turn and hear the pressure increasing, and I can also see the gauge on the top here rising as I turn in a clockwise direction. Conversely, if I turn in a counterclockwise direction, since there is already pressure locked in this unit, it won't immediately go down. So I'm going to use this pressure relief valve, pull it a couple times to release the excess pressure, and we can see that the pressure gauge has decreased. So repeating this process until we see the pressure that we're hoping for. I'm going to aim for about 12 PSI, so we're right where we need to be, and turning this locking nut back into place, we're set where we need to go. This ball valve here in the perpendicular position will cut off any gas to the keg itself. So if you're troubleshooting, if there's no liquid coming out of the top line, always check this first. Somebody with close of service or somebody cleaning the kegerator might have accidentally turned this gas valve off. Sometimes this gas valve is also turned off when we're changing nitro tanks. So always make sure that this is parallel with the gas tube itself to allow for gas to flow into the keg. Following this gas line to the keg, we can see that it enters the keg through this device here, which is the actual coupler. This keg coupler has 2 points of entry or exit. The first is this gas that we just discussed, where gas is pushed into the tank. The gas fills the chamber around the liquid product that's in the tank, and there's a tube that runs, or it's also called a spear, that runs up through the inside of the keg, and this is where the liquid goes. So the liquid will be pressurized from the outside and pushed up through the spear that's on the inside of the keg through a ball valve that is underneath this keg coupler. You'll see the liquid in the line here, and the liquid follows all the way up and to this tower here where it comes out of the faucet. The faucet also has a valve on the front that's controlled by the tap. So really all you're doing when you open a tap to fill a cup with cold brew is allowing the gas from the tank, an outlet, to go through the line, filling space in the keg, and then allowing the keg space to push the liquid through this line out of this faucet here. So realistically, we're just using this to pressurize this, and once we open this under pressure, that pressure forces the liquid out of the faucet. So let's talk troubleshooting. You come in the morning and are hoping to pour yourself a frothy cup of delicious Pure Intentions cold brew, and you pull the tap handle and nothing comes out. There's a few different things that we want to check to make sure that we're aware of all things in this system, because there are a number of variables that could have been changed over the course of a period of time, or as I mentioned in the previous section about opening and closing this, that could affect your cold brew service. So again, the first is just ensuring that all of your valves are in the right position and that you have pressure going into your keg. All of our kegs start with pressure in them. So there is a circumstance where you have a fresh keg, this is off, and you get a small amount of liquid that's coming out of the tap that turns into a trickle and stops. You could hypothetically look at this setup and say, I have pressure because my nitrogen tank is on. I had service just a second ago, so I know that the liquid in the coupler is able to escape, and I know that my faucet is working correctly, but now all of a sudden I don't have any product escaping. So 9 times out of 10, that's due to this ball valve being shut off, and you were actually using the built-up pressure that we deliver in the keg to service those first couple of cups. So all you would need to do is open that, allow the keg to repressurize and stabilize with the regulator, and you should have service once again. So step number 1 is checking your regulator. There are also 2 gauges on this regulator that are very important. The first gauge on top we already discussed is the PSI, or pounds per square inch, of pressure that you're using to force the liquid out of the tap. For the purposes of classic cold brew, we recommend between 10 and 15 PSI. For the purposes of nitro cold brew, which does require a separate tap that we'll cover here in a little bit, we do recommend between 35 and 40 PSI. This can be different depending on the run of your line, which means the distance between your gas source and your keg. So if you work in a bar environment where you have a cold box that's 50 feet or more away from your gas source, you may need to crank up the PSI pretty significantly in order to achieve the effective results to get the cascade of the nitro or to get a decent pour even with the classic. But for setups like this on a keg box, we recommend 10 to 15 PSI for classic and 35 to 40 for nitro. So beyond the PSI that is coming out of the tank, we also need to worry about how much gas is in the tank. So just like propane, there is a finite amount of gas that's actually in liquid form in this tank that converts to gas as it releases from the tank. This gauge on the lower portion tells you how much you still have left in your tank. We recommend replacing once you get down into the red zone. There is still going to be a little bit left, so you don't need to worry about replacing it that day, but definitely be placing your order for a replacement tank when this gauge goes down into the red zone here. You should be able to get around 10 kegs per 40 CU nitro tank. This is the size that we supply, so you should be able to get around 10 kegs. It is a little bit different with classic and nitro, and depending on how quickly you're running through them, there is a little bit of gas waste. So but if you're going through one tank per keg, it means you have a leak in your line, or even 2 or 3 kegs per tank, it most likely means you have a leak somewhere in your line. So just to be aware of that. All right, so we have our tank open, our gauges look great. We have our valve in the correct position. We follow that up here, and still, we've checked all this, still there's no product coming out of the faucet. One thing we might want to check is the coupler. This coupler has to be locked in place, so you can see that it has a lever movement here, and that click was locking it into place. If you check your keg and the lever is in the 45-degree up from the vertical or up from the horizontal position, it means that the tongs that are inside of this coupler are not pushing down on the ball valve that's in the top of the stem. So the ball valve is actually what keeps cold brew from spraying everywhere when you don't want it to be. So in order to actually activate the coupler, pushing that ball down and allowing the cold brew liquid to come out into the coupler, we have to pull this coupler lever out, still holding it out. We pull it down over the locking mechanism here and release it, locking that into place. So it should not move around. You shouldn't be able to lift it back up again once it's locked in place. Unless you pull this lever back out, it will force its way back up. So again, making sure that your coupler is locked in place here is a second very important step to ensuring product is going to be delivered to the faucet itself. So let's say that your nitro tank is full, your gauges look good, ball valve is in the right place, your coupler is connected in the right place. What else could possibly go wrong? We have seen in some circumstances where the cold brew coffee keg itself will be frozen. We deliver these kegerators when they're supplied by us with a setting on the temperature of the keg box that's ideal for cold brew coffee. Usually 40 degrees is the ideal temperature for cold brew coffee. But because it doesn't have alcohol, like beer, it will freeze a lot easier. So as you start to approach 32 degrees, if you were to turn this up close to the max setting on this particular kegerator, you would start to hear some slushiness in the keg, and most likely your line would freeze first. So if there was any cold brew in your line, you would start to see ice build up in your line. If this does occur, just check your temperature setting. You would want to turn this down to medium, open your door for a little bit, and try and let your liquid line defrost. Once that's the case, you can try it again, and most times, once this liquid line has defrosted and your temperature is set correctly, the cold brew will then come out of the tap. There are a couple of different setups for this particular temperature adjustment. On this single tap keg box, we have access to it very readily here in the front door. There are some models that we'll see in a minute that have it on the back of the kegerator itself, on the lower portion of the back. So this can be difficult in some circumstances if it's not set correctly when it's placed, if it's slid under a counter, or if there's some maintenance that's done to it and it's adjusted. You can create a circumstance where a particular employee doesn't know where the temperature adjuster is, or you would have to remove some piece of furniture in order to get the kegerator out. So just be very well aware that this setting should be around 40 degrees, no colder than that, because it will start to freeze as it gets closer to 32. So all that considered, those are the main steps that we want to look at in order to identify issues that could arise in getting, again, our pressurized gas into our tank, and that allowing the keg to be pressured and push liquid up through the liquid line and have it come out of our tap here. So our classic cold brew uses this standard beer faucet style because it's poured as a still beverage, not meant to cascade, only uses 10 to 15 PSI. The Nitro cold brew coffee product uses a stout faucet, which has a diffusion plate and O-ring set up in this nozzle head here, which forces at a higher pressure, 35 to 40 PSI, forces the Nitro cold brew through that diffusion plate and forces the nitrogen into the coffee more than we would see on the classic side, which allows for the cascade effect where it creates that creamy, foamy texture. So here we can see the different components that are inside a double tap kegerator. We can see the familiar primary regulator that will have the 2 gauges on it that we're familiar with, our pressure relief valve, as well as the ball valve for the on and off. So this is what will actually be attached to the nitrogen tank. We have 2 different keg couplers here. We can see that on the liquid line, there are indicators of which faucet they go to. Some may say 1 and 2. We put classic and nitro on some of ours. So just make sure that you're always changing a like keg for a like keg. So nitro kegs will always go on this coupler. Classic kegs will always go on this coupler. Otherwise, your different pressures that are coming through these 2 lines will throw off your service. So here we can see where our gas comes in. There is a T. So the gas is coming in from this line, from our primary regulator, coming into this T and coming down this secondary line going to the keg coupler that will service our nitro. On this side of the T, we're going up to our secondary or step down regulator where we'll go service the line to our classic cold brew keg. We have here another ball valve, so just be very careful that this is in the open position. We can also, so this is the perpendicular is closed, parallel is open. We also want to make sure that we're checking our pressure on this regulator here, and it still has the same twist or locking nut with a twistable adjustment, so that if you need to adjust that up or down, you can use that. Here we're looking at the back of the double tap kegerator just to talk about a few final differences. On this particular kegerator model and brand, they've placed the temperature adjuster on the back and the rear corner. So this just needs to be taken into consideration, because if you're sliding the keg box under any countertop or attaching it to any furniture that would make it difficult to access this if you needed to, just make sure before anything permanent is put in place that you have this set where it needs to be, so that the kegs are kept sufficiently cold but are not freezing. The other thing that's different about this keg box is that we have an opening here, so we can actually pull this plug out, and you can see that there's a hole here that's meant for a gas line. So you can actually run the nitrogen tank from the exterior of the kegerator through with a gas line through this hole to service the inside of the keg. That just allows for more space, so you could keep backup kegs or other refrigerated products inside the kegerator without wasting the space for the liquid before the nitrogen tank itself. Thanks for joining me today on our journey through cold brew and kegerators. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We sell cold brew in 5-gallon kegs in 24-count, 12-ounce cans, and we also provide support and kegerator sales as well. So thanks so much for your attention to these tutorial videos, and enjoy our cold brew.